Start recording. Yeah, it's recording. So, hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm delighted to introduce you to Carl Miller, Research Director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media. The center is hosted by the UK's cross-party think tank Demos and investigates the impact of the digital world on policies and politics. Carl's research interests span digital politics and democracy, automated decision-making, cybercrime, and online disinformation. And his work has been featured in renowned publications like Wired, The Guardian, and The Telegraph, and presented at numerous international events. And today he will discuss information warfare and how to detect it. So thank you very much, Carl, for joining us today, and I leave it to you.
All right. Thank you, Fabio. Thanks for having me. Hi, Stephen. Nice to see you. Pity we're not all in person, isn't it? But I'll do my best on Zoom. Now, show of hands, slides or no slides? What do you all prefer? Slides? Slides? All righty. Let's do slides then.
Well, oh, you have them. Good. I was going to say, if you don't have any, then don't bother.
No, that wasn't a bluff. betting the no slides will win out. No, can you all see this? Great. All right. So without further ado, let me tell you my origin story, at least, for this strange, sometimes mysterious, but I think kind of unbelievably important idea of information warfare. To begin, I want to go back to around 2005, 2006. I think that's a very, very important moment, because I think then kind of militaries around the world were all asking themselves the same question. I think they were all basically saying, we're now stepping into the information age. Information we can see all around us is becoming increasingly centric, increasingly important to societies, to people, to both our adversaries and the people we're trying to protect. And I think the question they will pose themselves, I think they felt like they were falling behind in one way or another. And the question they posed themselves was, how do we as militaries react to this? You know, how do we as militaries make information increasingly more centric to our work, just as it becomes more central and centric to everything else? And like a stack of dominoes, I think one after the other, militaries all over the world, both liberal democratic and autocratic, rewrote their military doctrines. Here's ours in the UK, integrated action. These are all published, kind of decision-making and problem-solving kind of documents that militaries write about who they are and what they do. It took different formulations, different kind of uses of language, different decisions in different countries, but largely, I think implicitly, the same thing happened, which is that all over the world, kind of present in these operational doctrines, information had been reconceived. Now, it's always been a tool of war. It's always been something that militaries, of course, use. You know, you go back to inflatable tanks in Normandy, or you go back to fake letters being written by Crusader knights. Of course, militaries have always been interested in kind of confusing and manipulating the perceptions of their adversary. But I think in the doctrine, something else happened, which is that rather than being a tool of war, information was reconceived as being a theatre of war. So a space that warfare happened within. So it kind of got elevated to join air, sea, and land, and then information as an arena of conflict. Now, we can debate in a second how new all of that is. Some people get I think it is quite new. I think the military doctrines, kind of the way they're actually writing about it, implies it's quite new, at least in their minds as well. Some people get very cross with me, emphasising the newness of this, though, and we'll say that this is thousands of years old as well. But I think that seeing information as an arena that conflict and geopolitical confrontation actually happens within was incredibly important. And I think what happened after that caused a divergence. I think liberal democratic militaries, probably under more legal constraint, reputational constraint, went in one direction. I think autocratic militaries went in another. But I think in different ways, militaries around the world began to confront with this reconceptualization. How do we fight information warfare? If information is an arena, then what does What does territory look like? What are our weaponry? What's our capability? They began to kind of build in one way or another kind of new capability of a sort to actually fight information warfare. And it was a kind of eclectic, kind of strange kind of merging of lots of different fields. I'm sure some of Stephen's kind of amazing work in cognitive psychology probably crept into military thinking somewhere or other. But there was, there was all kinds of papers on memetics being poured over, thinking around how ideas spread, how attention can be captured, how influence works, how behavior can be changed. I think it was a bit of a mishmash of cognitive psychology on the one side, I think dopamine and neurological psychology on another, sociology, information studies, all coming together to kind of begin to found this new form of warfare in a kind of serious way. A strange form of warfare. A form of warfare that would package ideas up in cats in order to make these ideas spread more readily and easily across the internet. I spent some time with viral advertising companies, and one of the things that first impressed me there was how they tried to clean away all so-called ballast from the ideas that they want to spread. They know that for ideas to spread, it has to cause an immediate emotional arousal in the viewer. And that is basically achieved through something being funny, cute, scary, sexy, or outrageous. And so packaging idea up as a cat is one of the ways in which you can elicit really that very immediate emotional arousal. And so Nyan Cat, Hacker Cat, 4chan was another community that well understood this idea. All these different cats kind of masquerading and parading around the internet is not necessarily an accident. I think in some cases it is actually an element of deliberate design around ideational diffusion. Sock puppets were invented, I think, around that time as well. Organizations, militaries, but others as well began to realize that they couldn't just talk to a crowd using these social media platforms that were emerging, but they could also pretend to be the crowds. A whole new kind of lie maybe could be told at that point. One where you could start to game social reputation systems. You could cause things to look like they were trending. You could cause things to look like they were far more popular or less popular than they actually were. So you could actually create crowd reactions, which you could try and make influential too. Now, I've started the story with militaries, and I've already mentioned 4chan and various kind of online cultural hacktivist collectives. And I'm sure you're kind of beginning to get the point that I've only made implicitly up to now, that more than one kind of actor was beginning to work on this kind of strange tradecraft. I think it was simmering around in militaries. I think it was simmering around in online kind of mobilizations and collectives. And it was also simmering around in for-profit groups too. And I really learned that when I went to Kosovo. I went there with a BBC kind of crew to shoot a documentary in about 2017. And we met a whole series of fake news merchants that I actually got to know. This is one of them, Besar. We're in a kind of darkened bar outside of the capital, Pristina. He was terrified that I was going to kidnap him, that I maybe worked for one of the social media platforms. So he turned up with like 20 of his friends. I mean, he was very friendly as soon as he realized that I wasn't actually there, but on behest of a tech giant in order to scoop them all away. And then he showed me really like how, for him, the kind of fake news industry, as he understood it, actually worked. A number of enormous Facebook groups that he kind of built and owned. None of them doing what they claimed to be doing. One was about pit bull dog fans, another one about exploring strange places around the internet, another one to do with viral news. And then he would use these groups, and I think that Besar there on the screen, that young man from Kosovo, managed to get his content into about as many pairs of eyeballs as the Sunday Times. He would then pump out content, packs and packs of content that he bought from other providers. And some of it was true and some of it was false. And Besar neither saw the difference nor cared particularly about it. For him, information was purely instrumental in terms of getting clicks. That is the only thing he wanted. So if Messi has actually broken his leg and people clicked on that, that would be great. If Messi hadn't broken his leg and people clicked on it, and that was one of the big stories of the day that he was distributing through his groups, as long as people clicked on it, that was okay as well. I actually challenged him on this. I said, this is fake. And he didn't really understand why that was something which I was complaining about, firstly. And secondly, I think when you're in Kosovo, and I think other areas like it, concerns around the pollution of the information environment feel very distant when a man like Bessar would be earning €6 a day working as a waiter if he wasn't earning €500 a day, a life-changing amounts of money in Kosovo, doing what he was doing. So there was actually like a very important kind of development perspective on all of this too. And he was actually earning that money in the same way, ultimately, technically, as all of the legitimate journalistic outlets that he was trying to ape. So when people clicked on his stories on Facebook in one of these groups, he would take them out of Facebook, harvest them, so to speak, and then take them to one of around a dozen kind of threadbare looking news sites that he was running. And on those news sites, he would sell their eyeballs in the same way that any journalist sells eyeballs nowadays, is using programmatic advertising that's kind of served up, bidded, using one of the two big ad exchanges. That, by the way, just as a sidebar, the rise of programmatic advertising, I think, is absolutely one of the most important kind of changes in how journalism and attention and money actually works. It's a story that's too often overlooked and not particularly well understood, but it's vastly consequential. This kind of change from, you know, an outlet like The Guardian directly selling to brands to every outlet, whether you're The Guardian or whether you're Bessar selling into one of the ad exchanges. Hugely important. Maybe we'll talk about that in the discussion afterwards. Anyway, he also showed me the secret closed groups where he and the other fake news merchants actually traded with each other. They were fairly large, and this is a fake news starter pack, believe it or not. So if you wanted to break into the industry, this is how you do it. This you can buy your fledgling groups in here, your scripts for monetizing the audiences, a content pack. You can see there are audiences down there, 24K, 16K. This is someone selling groups, I believe. And what this made me realize is that just as maybe militaries were thinking about how to capture attention for geopolitics, and maybe, you know, 4chan and LulzSec and others were doing it for the lulz and doing it for their own political or kind of or social needs or aims. Bessar was and the others, they'd created this kind of industry that were doing many of the same things, by which I mean platform manipulation, inauthentic behavior, sock puppetry, kind of various kinds of gaming. And they created an industry that was increasingly allowing specialization to happen. Like these people were each taking very specific little parts of the problem: how to unlock pages, how to defeat Facebook's surveillance systems, how to build audiences, how to monetize them, and then they began to sell them all to each other. Right. So you've got the for-profit world, you've got militaries, and you've got online mobilizations all coming together, kind of founding this strange new form of warfare. Before I jump in, the other thing I wanted to do is actually show, I'll actually do that as we go. From that to now, I think that idea that sees information as an instrument in order to exact some form of behavioral or cognitive or attitudinal change in audiences, I believe that is one of the ideas which has changed the world most, really, since whatever that origin is up to now. To show you, though, what it actually looks like, I want to bring you face to face with a really concrete example of it, and also an example of us pulling it apart. So this doesn't feel entirely abstract, and we can actually anchor it in some kind of data. And in doing so, I also want to tell you what it isn't, which I think is extremely important, because I think very often this sort of activity is very, very misconceived. So from 2005, come with me now, and we'll jump into 2022, very shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I don't know about you all, but every day, my whole digital world was flooded with a kind of mixture of outrage, for the invasion and sympathy for Ukraine. And so it was with real surprise that one day I woke up and saw "I stand with Russia" and "I stand with Putin" trending all over the internet. It was trending on a number of different platforms and in a lot of different global jurisdictions. So we decided we picked Twitter. This is while we still had good data access to Twitter, and we decided to actually pull it apart to see what we could see. It was a few days, by the way, before the UN General Assembly vote to condemn the invasion. So we thought that there might be some kind of, we suspected from the beginning there might be some kind of adversarial and inauthentic layer to all of this, if not the whole thing. Are there any social media researchers here? I don't know how deep you want me to go into social media research, but it was a completely new method that we hadn't done before. So it's 2022. So it's just when like the latest generation of like of natural language processing was emerging. And we kind of realized that we were able to do some kind of measurements and metrics using those approaches that we hadn't been able to do in the kind of 10 years that we've been trying to use natural language processing to study social media data. And that is basically this method, which we've actually developed and used a lot since then. I think it's really cool. So we took the 10,000 Twitter accounts that was really pumping out those hashtags, that were sharing it, I think, 5 times or more. We then took basically as many of their messages that they'd sent as we possibly could. So not just the ones containing the hashtags, but a deeper timeline for each account. I think around 200, 300 messages per account, for each of these 10,000 accounts. Then we used natural language processing models to measure the semantic similarity of every message sent by any of these accounts with every other message sent with each of these accounts. We aggregated that, so we had a semantic similarity score for each account versus every other account. And then we spatialized it. So we turned that vector position into a vector position and put it onto a map. And the point of that was to basically turn language into space and allow us to try and visualize which of these accounts were saying the same thing and which of these accounts were saying different things. And again, importantly, not just with the specific messages that they'd sent around the Russian invasion using those hashtags, but in general, what they were saying. This is the map that we produced. Now, I remember at the time, I had absolutely no idea whether this was going to be useful or not, or indeed what it was going to show us. But my kind of researcher heart like did begin to be lifted when I realized that this wasn't totally chaotic, and in fact there were like very specific, like quite concentrated distributions of different accounts. Those tiny dots you can see, each of those is an account. I can send a much higher resolution version of this over to you. Sorry for the quality if you'd like. We've actually got a 3D version of it on the website as well, if anyone wants to kind of saw around in a higher dimensionality version of it. So the next step, once we've got something like this, is to actually characterize what on earth these different clusters are. You know, you can see a modularity algorithm there has picked out some very clear different groupings for us. Those groupings intuitively look like they're just about right. So what are they actually telling us? Well, lesson 1 of actually pulling apart an influence operation is an enormous amount of the struggle for influence online is to do with identity. So these different groups, these different clusters are defined by different linguistic and national identities. So you've got a tight red cluster there in the left-hand side, and they are basically pro-BJP, pro-Modi spam bots. Very anti-colonial, lots of BRICS solidarity, use Hindi a lot. That extrusion of grey going up on the left, those are anti-BJP spam bots. They primarily speak Tamil. They almost all of them claim to be part of the Tamil Nadu province of India. You've got 2 long tunnels of accounts, the kind of orange that you see there, and then the green at the bottom. slightly less easy to define, but they're kind of like broader groups of kind of South Asian, Indonesian, Malaysian, Indian, Singaporean accounts, leading to the two other kind of vertices in this kind of rough triangle. You've got the South African cluster at the top there, yellow, and you've got this the only node which has no regional or linguistic identity, the blues there at the bottom. Very tight cluster though. And you've got a kind of anti-Indian, Pakistan, Iranian kind of Sindhi, Farsi using extrusion coming off there at the bottom and the left. Sorry, slightly on the right and the south. Lesson number 2. When you see what these accounts are actually doing, it brings us to, I think, the second reality of information warfare. I think by far the most difficult challenge being faced by people doing offensive information operations is actually getting anyone's attention. And that is what these accounts primarily were doing. So especially this percentage is the amount of retweet to tweet ratio. So what they're basically doing is they are pumping out retweets. All these accounts basically are doing, especially the blues, the greens, the reds, the grays, the dark greens. They are just spamming out retweet after retweet after retweet after retweet. Essentially trying to get I stand with Putin and I stand with Russia, I think, into the trending boxes of Twitter around the world. I think this is primarily an attack on the trending mechanisms of Twitter. And lesson 3, what they were actually sending essentially is the main influence vector, I think, of information warfare. So it's implicit up to now, I'll make it explicit now. I think that disinformation is a horrible way of explaining information warfare and explaining these kinds of information threats. I think disinformation sets up the idea that the main problem that we're facing is lies circulating around online. And if only we could do something about the lies, then we'll all be okay. But actually, pulling these campaigns apart over the years, you very, very rarely see people telling someone a lie about the world and getting them to change their mind as being the principal vector for influence. Instead, it's much more likely to see the main kind of, what would you call it? I suppose like theory of influence being tell people things they already think are true about the world, flatter their worldviews, agree with them, tell them that they're right, and then try and harness that in a particular direction. So like swim with people's confirmation biases. I know I don't have to tell you all that. I'm guessing you're all cognitive psychologists of one kind or another. You're probably the group I least need to make this point to. But it's absolutely astonishing how often people bring a very hyper-rationalist idea to the understanding of influence operations, I think, without kind of really recognizing like all the frailties that we have as human beings that can really be exploited of ourselves as kind of cognitive and social units. That's what was happening here. Tons of confirmation bias. None of these accounts were either claiming to be nor addressing the West. They were all addressing other audiences around the world, African, Asian, South Asian especially, with lots of anti-colonialism, trying to argue. I mean, there is some disinformation. Like there is a picture here of, it's claiming that Putin was around in the 70s, working with various kinds of anti-colonial liberation struggles. I mean, I've been assured by very high authority that he wasn't. But they're basically trying to tie in, as grotesque as it sounds, Russia's invasion of Ukraine as being some sort of anti-colonial, anti-imperial gesture. Lots of NATO whataboutism, underlining NATO, very legitimate grievances that people have around NATO interventions, around other military interventions around the world, and basically trying to expose Western outrage of Ukraine as being hypocritical and therefore baseless in the light of Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And then just Russian power memes, really, kind of NATO, like kind of anti-NATO, pro-Russian memetics. There is also underneath, I think, and this is the other thing that, so much better than disinformation. To me, a much better way of understanding this all is as the presence of professional, orchestrated, evaluated campaigns. I think influence campaigns being conducted by either for-profit or state bureaucratic professionals around the world is a much better way of understanding the nature of this kind of stable of information threats that you know, so much research and so much government activity and so much think tank activity has sprung up to try and counter. I prefer it because you can slot disinformation in as simply one of a whole series of tactics that might be used in order to garner influence, which might involve simply telling the truth. It also might involve telling one truth rather than another truth, and very often doesn't involve any kind of truth at all. Very often, as some of those examples there, it's much more likely to involve people addressing notions of kinship and belonging and family and meaning. The other reason it's important for us to see these things as campaigns, though, is because it allows you to start to dig into the actual underlying manipulation which is occurring. Like, this is not just about propagating messages. This is about attacking reputation systems online, search engines online, apps, and trending boxes, as this particular campaign shows us. And there we can begin to see the inauthenticity at play. So let's dive into the blues. Interesting, aren't they? This is the whole group of accounts that actually look intensely inorganic. They don't have any photos. They don't have any followers. And when you look at when they actually started tweeting, there's their volume on the day of the invasion and the day of the UN vote. Big spike, big spike. They're all super young. So here's the account creation date for the blue cluster. There they go. I mean, there's some simmering in the background in January and February, but look what happens on the day of the invasion. That is when all the accounts were actually created. And then we know, I mean, I can actually tell, I mean, so much is simply probabilistic in the world of trying to pick apart influence operations. But this is one where I can actually tell you hand on heart, we know it's inauthentic. We don't just think it's inauthentic, because the BBC then took our work and actually tracked down some of the people whose photos were used in the accounts. Actual people across India and Africa who said they had nothing to do with the accounts that were being used. Okay, I was going into Sweden. Sorry, I won't go. There's a whole other disinformation thing I could talk about Sweden, but let me finish with a couple of ideas around information warfare. So this is just one very small example, I think, of the kinds of campaigns that we see. It's not necessarily the most influential. It's not necessarily the most expensive. In many ways, I think this was a fairly cheap attempt. Really what happened, like stepping back now, having spoken to people and gone to South Africa and spoken to people about this campaign, spoken to people in the platforms about this campaign, spoken to people that had their images involved in the campaign, I can now, several years later, tell you I'm pretty confident what was happening there was a series of paid to engage networks. So they're normally used commercially to get stuff to trend. They were paid to basically, on that day, pivot from what they were doing. So the Indian BJP accounts were typically posting loads of Hindu nationalist film spam at the time. You know, the blue accounts, I think, were created for the purpose of this. They all pivoted, and then they were all paid to basically make I stand with Russia and I stand with Putin trend. I estimate this probably cost in the hundreds to the low thousands of dollars for a campaign like this to do. And it did manage to get not only I stand with Putin, I stand with Russia to start trending, but then to be written up in places like this, the Times. Articles were written unproblematically seeing and presenting the fact that I stand with Putin was trending in India, for instance, as some kind of bellwether of India's support for the invasion. Now, that is totally ridiculous, both by Twitter. Like, the fact that their trending bots could be attacked like this in the days after the invasion, I find to this day totally astonishing. You know, if we can spot this, why on earth Twitter couldn't? I have no idea. Most of those accounts are taken down now. But it's also, I think, really, really poor journalism for mainstream journalists to write that up. Like everyone has to know that information warfare is flowing in and around us. Everyone has to know that trending boxes are being targeted for geopolitical struggle. And to unproblematically see very gameable systems as somehow, without problem, representing the true attitudes of a population, I think is astonishing as well. And it worked. There was another follow-up. I haven't got the slide here. I can send you the article that The Economist did on our work. And they actually looked at the real people that might have come across this campaign. And especially in South Africa, interestingly, quite a lot of real people sometime later engaged with that trending hashtag and actually started talking about how they genuinely stood behind Russia and Putin, often for anti-colonial reasons in their eyes, and actually did start an organic discussion. Well, The Economist had a looked at all of that, and they actually think that the campaign did have some influence. Like people started talking more about the invasion and more supportively of Russia in the aftermath of this than before. Always a very, very difficult claim to make, and I'm sure a noisy one. But at the very least, it looks like maybe this is a campaign that might have broken through. We're at a crucial moment, I think, in terms of our responses to this. This was a very, very niche think tank geeky thing to be doing in like 2016. And now, of course, it's become like pretty central to the national security strategies that governments and states are drawing together. And it's increasingly, obviously, something that governments themselves are focusing on. And it's something that there's been absolutely enormous kind of academic and other kinds of research work being done on. To me, though, like we continue to suffer from this idea of conceiving of this as being a matter of truth and lies rather than a matter of covert and illicit influence. And I think that what that means still is that we're focusing on trying to measure lies circulating online, whereas the vast majority of the lies circulating online don't undercut our democratic systems and aren't something that require a governmental or other form of response. But then also, I think it's locked us into a series of quite truth-based responses, which are great for society in general. Fact-checking, digital literacy, I love all of that. I was calling for all of that in 2012, but it will not get us out of this problem of influence operations. Like they simply won't. They're not fast enough and they're not addressing the issue directly enough. And so like I think we're at a turning point where there is a growing realization that the influence operations are the main problem. The European External Action Service launched a new idea last year in Brussels called FIMI, which is a kind of pretty horrible acronym, foreign information manipulation interference. But I do think actually gets slightly more better and more directly at the problem. And I think as we do, there's going to be kind of increasing need for researchers, journalists, all of us and governments to find ways in which we can actually dig deeper into the actual presence of the campaigns themselves, like where they're being done, how they're being done, who's funding them. Those are probably some questions for investigative journalists. And then the big question for governments right now, I think, is probably how they can be disrupted. Because, you know, these are things which are being done with almost no risk, almost no cost, and you know, no jeopardy. And while that continues, of course, in the world of geopolitics, they're going to be conducted. So there we go. That's a bit of an origin story for you. I hope that's helpful. If anyone was wondering about the Sweden slides, I did a brief little sojourn, a wonderful, like, I'm half Swedish, it's always nice to go back, but I went to Sweden and then Norway a few weeks ago, in part to talk about, I think, one of the most successful influence operations that's yet been conducted, and that is targeting Sweden, basically alleging that Swedish social services are kidnapping the children of Muslim communities in Sweden, and then calling for people to emigrate from Sweden to protect themselves from that. It's been going on around since Sweden signaled it was acceding to NATO, and looks like it might be having some actual real strategic effects. So thanks everyone. Hope that was useful. Not quite sure. Like, yeah. So I've probably done 36 minutes. Great timing was excellent.
Thank you very much, Carl, for that. And that was indeed very interesting. And let's see if we have questions ready from the audience. Don.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I mean, scary, but fascinating. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of what strategies, like, did you have any classification of the types of influence strategies that you'd encountered? Because you talked a bit about how they targeted different groups of people
Mm.
based on what those groups already believed is true or how they already feel. So did you sort of, in general, were there sort of patterns to how they did this targeting?
Targeting specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, like religion-based or belief-based, and were there
Yeah.
general themes?
Great question, and actually leads me to a more general thought at the end, which I'll try and remind myself to come back to. I think if I was forced to summarize the general kind of influence vector that I think is often leveraged, it's address a particular audience, normally quite narrow, based often on a grievance that they have, recognize and contextualize that grievance, try and weave a narrative that grievance is as a result of some other process or thing. So that might well be mainstream journalists in the BBC, or it might be professional politicians, or it might be just a decrepit and corrupt West, whatever it is. And then try and guide that to some kind of response and reaction. You must join a conspiracy theory movement, or you have to give money to this old journalist voice or whatever. I think recontextualization of grievances is often what you see. And I often think that influence operations target much narrower groups than we often suppose they do. I think we often think of disinformation campaigns as, say, addressing an entire population. I don't think competent disinformation campaigns particularly often do that. But one thing that I don't think there's enough work on at all is the categorization of all of this, using some kind of sophisticated framework which tries to link this to standing cognitive or sociological theory of influence and behavior change. So there's an amazing kind of program, I suppose, or effort that I'm like kind of on the advisory board for, called the Disarm framework. And the Disarm framework is an attempt to try and create what they call TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, to basically try and itemize or atomize the different elements of influence operation. You know, how do they capture attention? How do they organize internally? What kind of messaging might they do? And there's kind of, you know, I mean, it's a big open source, crowdsourced endeavor. There's hundreds of different TTPs now. It's doing a really good job at beginning to systematize the way that we talk about and define them. But what I do not think has yet happened is a linking of some of those TTPs to kind of cognitive psychological theory or behavioral theory. What are the underlying ways in which this influence might be being had, which would be very helpful, because on the front lines of this, I don't think I feel we're somewhat theoretically underpowered, especially when we're thinking about how we can disrupt influence operations. We kind of need to understand the theory of influence that's being posited by the adversary, so that we can try and work out what kind of interventions we can make, whether that's addressing the audience they're addressing, or whether it's some other means to actually undermine that process. So yeah, I mean, anyone wanting to do that, any bright young PhDs that are thinking of a topic that you ever talk to, something like that would be really, really valuable.
Thank you. Strikes me as some of the things you're describing was pretty much encapsulated by the Brexit campaign, actually, quite scarily.
Well, you know, I mean, far be it from me to define a campaign as being an influence operation, but I mean, there's a in terms of tactics and techniques, there's a genuine overlap, a really significant overlap between completely legitimate advertising, you know, the political campaigning, and the activities of shadowy Russian intelligence agencies. And sometimes the FSB, I'm sure, will do things, were it done by an activist group in the UK or a political party, would be considered to be absolutely fine. So I've kind of increasingly tried to define the moral world here. I've never really written it down, but it's just something that I've been doing in my head in terms of two axes. One is legitimacy of tactic or technique. So that's like, there's a world of like completely white hat advertising, and then it kind of grows into a world of like a grayer world of like spam and, you know, search engine manipulation, bit embarrassing if you get caught doing it, not illegal. And then it goes into a world of absolutely illegal harassment, threats, hack and leak operations, you know, and certain kinds of actor will obviously inhabit various parts of that spectrum, but some will inhabit the whole part and happily merge together targeted advertising with a hack and leak operation. So the other axis has to be legitimacy of actor. And I would say, if you're the FSB, like in no world is it legitimate for you to be doing anything during our election. You know, you can be, you cannot, you know, it's not just a technique. Like they can't do things which we would be perfectly happy any of us doing. So anyway, it's quite a difficult world to define, really. You can't do it simply by the actor. You can't do it simply by the technique. It's got to be a kind of mixture of both. But yes, many of the techniques similar to mainstream party political campaigning for sure. And I suspect there is some overlap between the people that do this for geopolitical advantage and people that have done this for internal domestic political gain.
Thank you.
Yeah, might be my turn. Yeah, thanks. Fascinating stuff, Carl. I mean, you know, really impressive. And I pretty much agree with everything you said, that you know, we really need to get a handle on what's going on, and we have to understand these influence operations. Completely agree. I also agree that a lot of bad stuff that's out there is not necessarily involving disinformation or misinformation. You know, in fact, you know, the best you can do to people is to mislead them by telling the truth. You know, paltering is probably the best way to get people to listen to you. I agree with all that, but here's the problem. The way I see it, I still think that the truth dimension is nonetheless important, even though we shouldn't conflate disinformation with influence. I agree with you on that. But the reason I think that the truth dimension is still important is because it actually provides an attack surface. Because if somebody is lying, you know, and you can point that out and you can show them to be lying, that is undercutting their message with most people. Now, of course, there are some people who think lying is a feature, not a bug. I do understand that. But nonetheless, I think we and you said so yourself, you know, fact checking is all a good thing, and we have to do all this kind of stuff. So I wouldn't go as far as what you were saying at one point, that it's sort of the wrong way to look at the problem is by focusing on disinformation. I think it is the wrong way if that's all you do. But I also think it's an essential part of the response because it is something that you can deal with. The other stuff is just so much harder. And not only is it so much harder, it's also completely unclear to me what the response should be. And maybe you can comment on that. I mean, to my mind, what I would say is you have to identify an influence operation and shut it down. As simple as that. Okay, that to me is ethical because, as you were saying, the FSB has no business under any scenario to deal with our elections, right? So you identify them, you shut them down. Doesn't matter if they tell the truth or disinformation. But what if the actor isn't that illegitimate and they're telling the truth, and yet it's an influence operation? What's the right thing to do? Number one. Number two, how would you even do it? What's the legitimacy in shutting down true messages? And that's why I think the focus on disinformation is still very relevant, because there is a great moral justification for shutting down disinformation. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do. It's a great question. So for me, like the main focus really, I think, at the moment has been on the kind of lowest hanging fruit illegitimate actors, which kind of incontrovertibly you know, anyone, like any, you know, Republican, Democrat, still, I think there would be bipartisan consensus for them to be removed and that they are illegitimate voices. Yeah, maybe. I mean, but you know, and I see like an enormous amount of the genuinely like kind of threatening kind of online harms coming from like a reasonably small kind of group of state intelligence bureaucracies, like diehard committed conspiracy theorists and extremist political mobilizations online, all of whom are very deliberately, very self-consciously propagating influence operations. And they're for-profit proxies. And so for me, it's about really how do we put pressure on those groups, you know, before we look at anything else. And what those responses would be, well, some of it regulatory, like, you know, anyone can like Google buy retweets, you know, and see like the enormous number of like for-profit like platform manipulation offerings and companies that openly trade. Like, we need to do something about that. I think it's bananas that we're trying to teach like 70 million people how to spot an operation when we can actually go after the companies that do them. But then also, like, we do need to put more direct pressure on the people doing these campaigns, and I think that is a place where government needs to step in much more. Like, we need sanctions, we need no-fly lists, we need like various kinds of financial and kind of technical kind of interventions to stop them having such ready access to our information spaces. They need to be denied access to basically the Western tech stack, as far as I can see it. Like, they shouldn't be in our app stores, they shouldn't be in our operating systems. They shouldn't be be able to be on our search engines, and they shouldn't be using Western payment systems. Like, I think we still have a great advantage, like the healthy liberal democracies of the world, in that we control like the deep tech kind of substrate upon which all these campaigns actually work, and our denial of that substrate to them, I think, is massively underleveraged. As is, you know, the whole world of sanctions and kind of diplomatic and political pressure, which we've used, for instance, around, say, Chinese IP theft, which I think could, you know, this is a new world that we can begin to pivot that towards. I think, I mean, you know, I think the difficulty for me is that I don't see disinformation as being that kind of like strong basis upon which action can be taken. Because what I've seen over the last like 2 or 3 years is basically the word disinformation and the struggle over what is true and what isn't true being swept into the kind of burning furnace of US polarization and bipartisanship.
Yeah, of course.
You know, and I think what's really hard now, and I think basically what is going to be politically impossible, whether that's platforms, regulators, or governments, is any kind of sensible, rational, clear-eyed definition of the truth in a way that will be sufficiently consensual to allow meaningful action to take place. In
the US, undoubtedly, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I think as far as possible, I think that not having, you know, I actually do see the platform's point of view in them not wanting to be arbiters of truth and lies in any broader way than they possibly can be. I think not having centralized nodes of decision making around truth or lies is actually one of the features of democracy. I mean, truth is messy. Like, you know, some things we can cut through, and I know we all prize it, and I know facts exist, and I know the truth exists as well, but it is something which has always been a negotiation between different kinds of people with different kinds of values and perspectives. And we do, in democracies, I think, kind of generally get on fairly well with that messiness. We kind of recognize that it's not something that there will be a single authority we can all look towards for. And already the world of fact-checking and platform regulation has become, you know, has been swept in. You know, and all of us that work on this, we've been seen as being part of the kind of, you know, censorship industrial complex and everything.
Of course. Else. Yeah, of course.
You know, and I think kind of, I hear what you're saying, and I think maybe one of the way forwards would be to like identify the Venn diagram of harmful, clearly falsifiable disinformation that is most used by very bad actors for various kinds of influence ends. You know, for instance, like, you know, flagrant anti-vax being amplified by Russian fellow travelers. You know, I think that might be where we could agree there is, you know, there is the strongest basis really to act when it's both the content and the nature of the actor, which gives us some basis to do some kind of response.
I think there was a question from Angelo.
I think it's my turn. Thank you, Carl. Very, very fascinating talk. Just a comment about some new trends in disinformation campaigns. I think I'm getting increasingly worried by the sophistication. The sophistication level this is getting, in the sense that the use of bots and disinformation campaigns based on single accounts, mainly on Twitter and Facebook, it seems to be a bit old-fashioned now, or at least just a single dimension of more sophisticated or comprehensive disinformation campaigns. For instance, the use of the whole platform as a disinformation vector. I think there are more or less robust evidence that the algorithm of the TeDCog algorithm is favoring the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party, for instance. So they are using the whole platform as a vector for, well, I wouldn't say disinformation. Sometimes it's disinformation, sometimes it's just pushing a line of thought or a opinion trend or something like that. Or the relevance of some topics over others, and you can push an agenda through that. Something similar may be happening with X.
Well, I was just going to say that, Elon.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, this guy bought the platform to push his own agenda and the agenda of his political connections, right? Which are very unclear, and they change every month, apparently. But other trend I see is this, at least it's something I'm seeing in Spain, and it's something we can call synchronized opinion. It's like a new Olympic sport, since that when someone wants to push an agenda, you see offline and online a synchronized opinion between, the typical bots and the old-fashioned campaigns. But also you see journalists, you see movies, you see documentaries, you see WhatsApp, and you see memes, you see YouTubers, and they go in the same direction, right? So it's a multi-platform, online, offline, super complex campaign that is truly choking freedom of thought and the independent opinion. And what do you think about this? Do you think maybe our studies or our focus on these single account bots, disinformation, fake news, this typical fake news from that neolithical first Trump campaign, do you think we are getting a bit behind?
I think we've always been behind. But firstly, yeah, I totally agree. The obvious bots, like the ones I showed you, I kind of view them as being like World War I tanks, kind of still on the battlefields. But you know, certainly not where the business end of a sophisticated campaign. I think they're also getting much more sophisticated in all likelihood, like psychologically. You know, I think there's a technological aspect of this, but there's also, I think, a kind of another line of development where they've threading much more intricately into their campaigns understandings of how humans behave in order to create much more subtle, much less visible forms of influence activity. Like for instance, like, I don't know if they're doing this, but my big fear is that they're going to use generative kind of text models to kind of basically start weaponizing friendship. Can you imagine if you had, you know, kind of models addressing 10,000 people in parallel, you know, of a particular, you know, activist persuasion, you know, each one of those, you could have a months-long conversation with them, You know, how they're doing, how's their day, how's their work. Oh, I can't believe you didn't get a promotion. You know, you could turn that into an influence vector that would be so much more powerful than the random Twitter account that's spamming you some kind of nonsense. I think, and yes, like I completely agree that I think attackers will not really, you know, if you're on the offensive end, you're not really bothered. Like you're of course not constrained by a particular sort of influence. So yeah, you'll be hiring influencers, and you'll be manipulating platforms. You'll probably be doing quite a lot of stuff that we don't see as well, like economic subversion, bribing people, suborning people, probably harassing people, your opponents. We see quite a lot of that, you know, like these networks and operations are partly designed to try and drive away kind of hostile or contrarian voices to their aims. We've really got to try and catch up with that multi-platform area of influence, I think, as researchers. I mean, very often, like the research I just showed you, it's not just one vector of influence, as in information. It's actually just one platform. You know, how narrow is that as a window into what's going on? That's one of the things at Chasm, my research team and all of my colleagues, like that's one of the things that we're working on as fast as we can, really, is how to make our research as multi-platform as possible, to try and encompass the various different arena where all of this might be being done. The problem is it's just really hard. It's really, really hard to spot. You know, that silly Twitter bot campaign I showed you, you know, the trending attack, you know, a few $1,000s maybe to do. Like, you know, we were spinning up supercomputers to run these models. We got professors of natural language processing. You know, I had 4 like PhD data scientists kind of going through the results. It's like there is a huge asymmetry in how easy it is to do versus how hard it is for us to kind of really convincingly, you know, show that it's being done. We've just got to kind of, I suppose, like take solace in the fact that we ultimately, there's more of us. Hopefully we're more energized and motivated, and we care more about information spaces. But I can see that
I just want to flag that I have to leave in 2 minutes. I have another meeting, and so does Almog, I think.
And so do I, in fact.
Oh, okay. So thanks, Carl. That was really, really interesting, and I hope we can stay in touch and you know, kind of talk a bit more about this, because it's fascinating stuff and tremendously important.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, everyone. A real pleasure to talk to you all. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Fabio, and all best. And yeah, hopefully see you before too long.
Okay, take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye, everyone.